Introduction to Practices of Mindfulness and Self-Compassion, Caregiver Stress and Worry. When we are care partners for people living with dementia, we have an incredible role to fulfill, coupled with multiple responsibilities and seemingly endless tasks. It is normal for the mind and body to feel overwhelmed at times, fraught with stress and worry. It is also a natural human tendency for us to ruminate on the details of our difficult emotions and the difficult situations that arise whilst we caregive to our loved ones. As humans, we tend to replay these feelings of angst, pain, and suffering over and over again, looking to the logic mind to resolve. What happens, though, is that as we ruminate in the details of our pain and suffering, we can get caught up in them. We can get stuck in the past, thinking about our regrets and all of the woulda, shoulda, couldas, and we look to the future with worry and what-ifs. This can lead us to that place of feeling anxious and overwhelmed, and can eventually become door openers to anxiety and depression. When we experience difficult emotions or situations, and we are not in the present moment, we become reactive to our pain and suffering. Practices like mindfulness and self-compassion teaches us to take a pause and ask ourselves, what do I need in this moment? These skills and practices can then teach us to respond to the difficult emotions or situations in a new and kinder way. We can develop a new relationship to our pain and suffering, and therefore learn to respond instead of react. The practices of mindfulness and self-compassion teach us to stay rooted and grounded in the present moment. In mindfulness, we begin to take notice and become aware of ourselves and our environment in that one moment. By paying attention on purpose, without judgment or criticism, but by simply accepting that moment as it is, we begin to anchor to the now moment. In the now moment, there is no opportunity for past regrets nor future worry to reside. And when we feel pain and distress, we have a human tendency to be critical of ourselves, further adding to our own suffering. Self-compassion practices teach us to treat ourselves with loving kindness, just as we would treat a good friend who is suffering in a similar way. For most of us, caring and giving compassion to others feels very natural. However, when it comes to ourselves, we may feel selfish or undeserving of this kindness as our inner critic arises. Did you know that research has shown that people who treat themselves with kindness and self-compassion actually have more compassion to give to others? It is like when we, as caregivers to our loved ones, fill up our own cups with kindness and self-compassion, we re-energize. As we learn to comfort ourselves with kindness, everyone ultimately benefits, as we have more to give. According to Dr. Christian Neff, self-compassion is made up of 3 parts: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. The first component of self-compassion is self-kindness. With self-compassion, we learn to treat ourselves with kindness, care, and support, just as we would treat a good friend that we cared about. There is an action component to self-kindness, and it involves actively soothing and comforting ourselves when we experience pain and or suffering. This active form of self-compassion actually activates a nurturing hormone in our bodies called oxytocin, and this helps to alleviate stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol. The second component of self-compassion is common humanity. With self-compassion on board, we have the capacity to see our own imperfections as not a unique experience, but rather part of the larger human experience. We are all imperfect beings. As humans, whenever we struggle or fail, we have a tendency to feel that something is wrong, this shouldn't be happening, or sometimes even something is wrong with me. This can make us feel separate and alone, different than the rest of mankind. Common humanity reminds us that we are more similar than we are different, particularly in regards to our own imperfections. The third component of self-compassion is mindfulness. In order for us to benefit from the use of the practices of mindfulness and self-compassion, we must first know and be able to recognize that we are in fact in pain and are suffering before we can respond to it. The practice of mindfulness allows us to take notice of what is arising and invites us to make space for it and gently turn towards it. In doing so, we learn to be with our pain and suffering just as it is. However, the practice of mindfulness requires balance. If we over-identify with our pain and suffering, we can then again become stuck in our stories in a different way. While we do not want to suppress, avoid, or deny what we are feeling, we also do not want to be swept away by the drama of our own pain and suffering, or what we call over-identification. The truth is, none of us want to feel pain and suffering, though the human journey of life is filled with both joy and laughter and pain and suffering. By learning to approach ourselves, our lives, and our loved ones with self-compassion and mindful awareness, our experience of pain and suffering can be transformed.